Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Helen and I'm from the stunning metropolis of Asheville in western North Carolina, known for its picturesque idyllic setting in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Asheville is an area of extreme national beauty and a temperate climate. I am so privileged to live here because 50% of our county is national forest, and we have everything to feast your eyes on here, from resplendent views, stunning waterfalls, streams, creeks, and so much more. The name Natala is Cherokee for the land of the noonday sun. This is because the sun only reaches the deep gorges of the forest floor at high overhead in approximately midday. This part of the world was the homeland of the historic Cherokee, along with their former indigenous ancestors, who were perceived to have inhabited this area for thousands of years, long before the white man ever settled here. I grew up in a well-executed, elegant home in Macon County in the 1980s, which was designed by an esteemed architect at the time who built us a prepossessing, prodigious ranch-style home that overlooked the bewitching, mesmerizing views over the majestic mountain ranges, sculptural rocky outcrops, and a variety of mountain oaks on the lower elevations that rose up to hundreds of spruce trees on the higher elevations. Our ranch-style home was situated in the middle of a pretty valley on the edge of a long gravel driveway and was surrounded with velvety green turf, ubiquitous trees, a pond and stream that flowed through the bottom of our property. It was not uncommon to see the indigenous wildlife on our land, from porcupines to otters, beavers, squirrels, white-tailed deer, black bear, bobcats, mountain lions and coyotes, and I have more or less had one-on-one encounters with all of these animals at one point in time. I lived in this sumptuous, cosy abode with my older siblings, 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and my stepfather Franklin. My biological father and mother got divorced when I was about 3 years old, and so my biological father returned to his hometown in Canada, and I did not get to see him much after that, except for on the occasional holiday. I was about 10 when Franklin, my stepfather, moved into our home to live with us after he married my mother. It was the fastest courtship you could ever imagine. Within 3 days of meeting my mother, he popped the question, and they tied the knot in secret on a spontaneous, random and unexpected trip to Vegas. I remember how flabbergasted and speechless we all were when they returned home to surprise us and announce that they were now married. My older siblings were absolutely appalled and knocked for 6, especially my older sister Clara, who was certain that there was something very shifty and nefarious about Franklin. Little did we realise that sooner or later she would be proven exactly right about her premonitions regarding this horrible, duplicitous and guileful man. At first, Franklin seemed reverential, polite and well-mannered towards my mother. They initially looked like a couple that were in love, but then it seemed with the flick of a switch he became so controlling, possessive, condescending, arrogant, bull-headed and exceedingly jealous. Before long, my mother and Franklin were at each other's throats, night and day, and it became like a dreadful war zone in our home, with bickering, arguing, raised voices and constant tantrums. My mother was not the type of woman to put up with being bullied, patronised or belittled, and she wasn't afraid to stand up for herself and speak her mind, although Franklin was beginning to wear her down with his constant hen-pecking. It would seem that anything would set Franklin off into an agitated frenzy. On one occasion my mother was ordering doughnuts at the baker and making pleasant small talk by saying to the baker what a lovely day it was. The baker gave my mother an extra 2 doughnuts, which he presented to her with a broad beam. Franklin was in the baker's at the time and was absolutely furious with my mother, claiming that she'd been flirting outrageously with the kindly gentleman. I remember he went crimson in his face. He was so angry, and he was as mad as hell. He never physically attacked my mother, of course, but I always got the sense that there were times he would have loved to throttle her if he could. I was just being cordial, she told him. That's what people are like around here. We look out for each other. It's called being neighbourly. It's called being friendly. Is that so? He screamed. You think fluttering your eyelashes at the baker is being neighbourly? You're an outrageous flirt. You love drawing attention to yourself because you want all the men to look at you. I can see it in your eyes. You're shameless. Stop being so ridiculous, Franklin. Nothing could be further from the truth. I hate drawing attention to myself. I'm actually quite unassuming. I'm not stupid, Sheila. I can see what's going on here. I wasn't born yesterday, you know. They were the kind of pathetic rows that they would have day after day, and night after night. Another time, when he and my mother were going to a party together, he told her that she looked cheap, salacious, trashy and tarty, like a wanton hooker on the street corner, wearing such a revealing, saucy dress. I kid you not, he took some scissors and cut her dress into shreds. My mother was furious and mortified, because it was a snazzy, expensive, sophisticated dress that looked stunningly beautiful on her and served to highlight her shoulder-length auburn hair and her flawless pale skin. I assure you the dress was not inappropriate, nor was it raunchy in any way, and the only reason he didn't want her to wear it because he didn't want people to admire my mother's outfit. He hated and despised her getting any attention, especially as it threatened him so much. "How about this, dear?" said Franklin, retrieving the tent-like dress my mother had worn when she was 9 months pregnant with me. "Now, this will look good on you, dear. It's a very nice brown colour." I believe my mother was so browbeaten and bullied that she actually went to the party wearing that hideous dress just to appease Franklin. Everyone asked her if she had something to tell them. Was she expecting? She looked like she was wearing a large sack. It was so ridiculous. It was when Franklin began to call my mother all kinds of horrifying derogatory names that my older brother Bernard stepped in. He'd had quite enough. My brothers were exceedingly protective of my mother, and they knew Franklin had overstepped the mark and gone too far this time. That was when he literally demanded Franklin to leave our home. "No one speaks to my mother like that. Now go, leave at once," he demanded. "This is not what you want, Sheila dear," said Franklin. "You don't want to turf me out of the house like this. I'm your husband, after all." "No, you're not any more," my mother snapped. "Franklin, I want you out of my life. I never want to see you again. I'll send you the divorce papers to sign. Now out of my house and out of my life." "I will not sign anything," Franklin protested. "I'll never give up on you, even if you've given up on me, Sheila. I love you." I'll never forget that day when Franklin left for good. It was like peace finally descended over our home that had been enveloped in such an oppressive and negative energy for so very long. The heaviness had lifted. It was as if the sun was shining on our lives again. Suddenly our home was filled with laughter and happy voices, and we began to be a loving family again. Well, almost. Not long after Franklin left our home, my mother always got the troubled sense that someone was watching her every move. She would complain of a suspicious-looking black car with blacked-out windows that would always seem to be following her when she left the premises, which made her become rather panicked and uneasy. It got worse when mysterious parcels arrived on our front doorstep, all addressed to her. On one occasion my mother opened a parcel addressed to her which contained a live snake that nearly gave my mother a heart attack. She hates snakes. It struck her with its forked tongue and bit her, but was thankfully harmless. Another time it was a pig's snout in a box, and the third time was the most terrifying time of all, which was when a florist's van delivered 6 individual funeral wreaths for each member of our family as some kind of menacing omen or warning for us, if you like, that hung over our family like a dark, ominous thundercloud for a long time. We did visit the florist to find out who had ordered the ambiguous wreaths for us, but the florist had only received a brown cash-filled envelope in the door with instructions on what to do and our delivery address. It was the most abominable thing that has ever happened to us and left us feeling very distressed and discomposed. My mother was convinced that these ominous, inauspicious-looking funeral wreaths had been sent to us by Franklin, who was ultimately seeking revenge for being turfed out of our lives. When she reported the incident to the police, she was informed that there was no real evidence to speak of, so we couldn't really cast blame at Franklin's door, even though they did agree that he was indeed the likely culprit. She was told that there was no real proof to cast the blame at Franklin's door, even though they did agree that he was the likely culprit. We were informed that without proof there was not much we could do about the constant harassment, which was very unfortunate. If that wasn't bad enough, we received a very menacing, portentous message where the capital letters had been cut out of a magazine with the words, "You will die soon," pasted on the paper. It truly sent direful chills down my spine, and I remember our entire household was always looking over our shoulders all the time in nervous apprehension that was swallowing our lives like a snake digesting a rat. We all had this airy sense of foreboding perturbation that something quite terrible was going to happen in the not-too-distant future, but what we couldn't imagine. One day Clara caught me crying on my own in my bedroom. I was so overwhelmed by fear in regards to the strange things that were happening in our home, especially of late. In recent days our windows had been smashed in, our seedlings in the front yard had been ripped out, someone had sprayed the words "whore" in red paint over our front door, and all the nefarious things that were happening to us were too numerous to count, but they were so creepy and so unnerving. It felt like I was being stung every day by a raging nest of hornets, and I was trying to hide in the shadows to prevent being attacked. Clara asked me what was wrong. I told her that I kept having a horrifying dream, and I was almost certain that the whole family was going to die very, very soon. "Don't be so ridiculous," she said. "You're going to come with me now, and we're going to cycle down some of those dirt roads on our mountain bikes. It's about time you and I had a little fun, instead of remaining cooped up in this house." She was right, of course. Our family hadn't really let their hair down in a long time, as all these tumultuous events had left our nerves frazzled and left us feeling very jaded. In a trice, Clara and I were pedalling down the charming country lanes, like the good old days before Franklin arrived on the scene to paint a cloud of blackness over our colourful, vibrant lives. It felt so good to be out there in the natural world, surrounded by the ravishing views of the mountainous valleys, statuesque trees, and open prairies filled with pretty wild flowers. It was just so breathtakingly beautiful that I was bedazzled and beguiled by the exquisite scenery that we had barricaded ourselves from for so very long. There was a delightful cool breeze blowing against my face, and I felt so alive as my dark auburn hair was thrust back in the wind. We sauntered down remote country roads on our bikes, jolting and wobbling precariously over some of the chunky stones, many quite sizable. Finally, Clara and I parked our bikes against a large spruce tree and ventured towards an open prairie, ducking under the white-poled fencing to get there. We were hoping to find the 2 grey mares that were usually frolicking in the fields, but they weren't there today for some reason. Maybe the owner had taken them out for a ride. I felt a rising sense of disappointment. I hadn't seen Horseshoe and Mustang Sally for such a long time, and they were such gentle, docile mares that I loved to talk to and stroke. Their velvety coats were always so beautiful. Even so, the prairie was exquisite to behold, with its long grasses and wild spring flowers, and it was lovely to watch the butterflies dancing from one flower to another with their delicate, colourful wings. Suddenly Clara pointed to a spruce tree where we could see an incredibly glamorous, luxurious and potentially quite valuable fur coat lying upon the ground haphazardly. "It looks like a superb fox coat. Who would throw out something so precious?" she said, looking aghast. "Well, if they don't want it, I'll have it," she said, marching through the long prairie grass. The wind was making a loud howling sound, and Clara's clothes were being punnelled violently as it increased in its intensity and was getting more feisty by the minute. But it was no match for Clara's resolve and determination. She wanted that coat, come hell or high water, through rain, snow, wind and hail. She was intent on having it, come what may. Clara proceeded towards the tree with purposeful intent, determined to retrieve the stunning coat, with me trailing awkwardly behind her. as the wind was now blowing even my hair in my face. I could see that the fox coat was indeed very opulent and swanky. It had a lovely sheen and was a very attractive red colour, but it did smell really rather niffy, musty and damp. Put it this way, it looked a little dusty and bedraggled, as if it had been exposed to the elements over several days, such as dirt and the rain, which was a dreadful pity. "I think you should leave it," I suggested. "It smells a bit nasty and rank. I don't know if you can actually clean fox fur all that well, and this thing could potentially stink the house out. Mum won't be best pleased if you brought a coat home that leaves a nasty stench around the place." "Of course you can clean fox fur," she said. "This thing is worth a bob or two, and once it's cleaned up, it'll look like $1 million on me." My sister began reaching towards the coat and trying to lift it off the ground with her hands and tugging at the fur, but then it moved, and Clara let out a shrill scream. "It's alive! Oh my God, it's alive!" The coat suddenly moved very awkwardly, and then suddenly we saw a pyramid-shaped head merging from this bunch of long flowing auburn hair, and then 2 deep-set golden eyes opened ever so slowly, and then suddenly very fast, and stared at us for a moment. The creature then rose up onto the ground and stood up on 2 feet, looking really rather dazed and disorientated because he'd been startled out of a very deep sleep. I think he was as bewildered and as surprised to have his hair tugged like that, and of course to see us, as we were to see him. We all just gawked at each other for several long minutes in a rather stunned, silent stupor, hardly daring to believe what we were actually seeing. I've often been asked, "But didn't you feel fear?" I can honestly say that fear was the furthest thing from my mind at that moment. I was overcome with curiosity, intrigued and even excited to see something so spectacularly out of place in the American wilderness. It's not every day that you spot something so anomalous and unexplainable that is steeped in mystery. The first thing that got my attention was this creature's glorious mane of red hair. It was magnificent, and in the sunlight it gleamed with so many tones, from soft to dark reds. I can't imagine what a colour like that would cost in a hair salon, an arm and a leg most probably. Furthermore, a coat like that to wear would certainly cost you a pretty penny. The creature was very svelte, long and lean, with extensive muscular definition and overlong arms. It was easily about 6 foot tall, 400 pounds, and 2 foot wide. It had a pyramid-shaped head that merged into the shoulders seamlessly, and a very defined heart-shaped face, with deep-set, very intense brown eyes, a flat nose, prominent brow ridge, and a slender mouth. I realised that the creature was not a male but a female, as it had fur-covered small breasts and a very feminine salmon-brown leathery face, and it looked like a cross between an ape and a man. It wasn't remotely aggressive towards us, but seemed reticent, self-conscious, timid, and almost painfully shy, and appeared eager to get away from us. We watched her glide away. She was so graceful and beautiful, and her movements so fluid that she almost seemed to float away from us. "What the heck was that?" said my sister. "Did you see what I saw? It was a humanoid ape. My word, I really thought that was a coat." Despite the heavy wind, my sister and I got onto our bikes and rode home as fast as we could to tell everybody what we'd seen. My heart was fluttering with excitement, and I was champing at the bit to tell my brothers our incredulous story. I knew that they would be so gutted not to have seen the critter for themselves. As we got home, I did discern a very dark car parked further down the road, with its windows ominously blacked out, but I didn't give it a second thought. We told everyone what we'd seen, but did not receive the reception and reaction that we'd expected. Instead, my brothers believed Clara and I were firmly mistaken, and that we'd really only just seen a bear. That very night we all returned to bed early, and the next thing I knew is that I was being lifted out of my bed in the middle of the night. I was in such a terrible daze. I was struggling to wake up, and could barely breathe, and every breath I took felt painful and laboured. My chest felt so incredibly heavy, almost as if someone was standing on top of my lungs and squeezing the oxygen out of my body like toothpaste from a tube. I did cough and splutter a few times, but I felt almost like you do when you're coming around from an anaesthetic in a hospital and you're trying to fight that dreadful drowsiness and struggling to overcome the wooziness. For a moment I did manage to open my eyes, and that was when I saw her, the very same creature I'd seen earlier in the day. The curious critter was carrying me out of our house and placing me on the lawn. I knew it was her, because I recognised her at once, because of her golden hair and body smell, which were terribly distinctive and arresting. For a moment our eyes met, but this time she did not look reticent. Instead, she looked worried and very concerned. And when I opened my eyes wide, she let out a very quiet whooping sound, as she seemed pleased to see me awake. It was like this, whoop! I was feeling very confused and disorientated, and even more so when I observed another one of these critters carrying my mother and placing her on the lawn, close to where I was. What were they doing, I wondered? Why were they placing me on the lawn like this? Nothing was making any sense to me at all, as my mind was in a complete whirl. Soon my whole family was all lying in a long line together on the lawn, and then I remember nothing more. In my sleep-ridden state, I discerned the drone of voices and sirens, and I could hear someone saying, "I think they're all breathing." That's all I remember, and then everything goes blank after that. The very next thing I remember was waking up in the hospital and the nurse calling the doctor and saying, "The first one's awake." The doctor came into the room and looked at me kindly. "Who have we got here?" he asked. "I'm Helen," I said. "Hello, Helen. I'm Dr. Fletcher. Do you know why you're here?" he asked. "Not really, doctor." "Your house burnt down last night." "My family," I gasped. "Are they all right?" "Everyone is doing fine," he assured me. "You had a lucky escape. You could have easily all perished in that fire, and are lucky to be alive with all that smoke inhalation you received. Your house went down fast. Do you know who rescued you?" All I could say was, "No, not really." "Well, whoever they were, they broke down that front door of yours to get to you. How they did it, I can't even imagine." To cut a long story short, we were to discover that Franklin had indeed started the fire surreptitiously when we were fast asleep in our beds. The fire brigade were able to prove that it was arson, as an accelerant had been used to start the fire. The police were able to find traces of the very same accelerant used in our house on the steering wheel of Franklin's blacked-out car. It would seem he'd been spying on our family for ages, and was determined to kill each and every one of us. He made a full confession to the police, and admitted he wanted us all dead, because we'd turned our mother against him. He also wanted my mother dead, because he couldn't bear the thought of her with another man. For a long time I pondered what I'd seen that night, when we'd been rescued by the strange creatures that I now know are Bigfoots. I kept telling myself I must have imagined the whole thing, because why would those creatures concern themselves with a handful of human lives? Why would they bother to rescue us? Who are we to them? And why did they even care? The police were mystified about our rescue, because no one acknowledged they had rescued us that night, and it was deemed a miracle. It was an enigma to everyone how we'd been spared. The house, of course, was completely destroyed, and was eventually rebuilt a whole year later. When my real biological father learnt about what had transpired, he immediately flew over from Canada to spend time with us, and he rekindled the flame with my mother, and they got remarried the following year, and were so happy, and don't even remember why they ever got divorced in the first place. One day Bernard told me something very strange, affirming to me that Bigfoot did indeed rescue us. He said he remembered a red-haired creature carrying him out of our house that night, and then he remembers blacking out. I do not know how or why those two red-headed Bigfoots rescued us that day, but they were the reason we're still alive today. As for Franklin, I'm glad to tell you he was charged and went to prison, but died of cancer 15 years ago. So there you are. That's my story. Well, this isn't the first time I've heard about Bigfoot rescuing people from a fire, so what an extraordinary story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Parker, although I'm known by my friends and family as Whitehawk, because I've always been so passionate about flying my bush plane and soaring above the clouds, as it's the closest feeling in the world to being as free as a bird, and feeling quite literally on top of the world. I was born and raised in Fairbanks, Alaska, and have lived here all my life, with my mother, father, and my two sisters, and last but not least, my grandparents, of course. In this part of the world, the interior and some of the bush region, we experience some of Alaska's extreme weather conditions, with temperatures like 50 degrees below zero, which is why Fairbanks has earned an undisputed reputation for being extremely cold. Much of Alaska is covered in permafrost, and is also home to the largest glacier in North America, called the Bering Glacier. As you can imagine, it is mandatory here to drive with special tyres on our roads, especially during the winter months, when conditions on the roads can be treacherous, dodgy and hazardous. I tend to use a winter tread tyre with studs, while some people like the Blick's Axe because they're pretty good on slick surfaces that stick to ice. We also have plug-ins that we plug into our vehicles in order to heat up our vehicles while at work or visiting Walmart or any other place. These plug-ins are situated on short little poles in parking lots, looking much like old parking meters. Also in Fairbanks, during the freezing weather, rivers and lakes can freeze over, transforming them into what the locals refer to as ice bridges, which you can drive over to take a shortcut, and they can be very useful. In early spring, many people sometimes take such incredible risks over those ice bridges to their own peril, as by then the ice is invariably melted, so they end up needing to be rescued as their vehicle begins to start sinking through the melted ice. Fairbanks is a vibrant, spirited and colourful city in the far north of Alaska, where downtown we have a thriving arts community, rich native Alaskan culture, interesting shops, excellent restaurants, quirky coffee bars, and so much more. Alaskans naturally heartily enjoy the pleasures of the natural world, especially the aurora borealis and the midnight sun, and we have mesmerising, long-lasting sunsets and sunrises here that will literally, quite literally, take your breath away. As winter arrives in Alaska, everything is carpeted in thick layers of crisp white snow that glisten in the light of day and swathe all the alpine trees in layers of snow icicles that look like delicate crystals. The daylight hours of winter shrink back and shorten, so you invariably leave for work in the early morning when it's dark, and then you return in the early afternoon and it's dark. I love living in Alaska because it's such a breathtakingly exquisite part of the world. It lies extreme northwest of the American continent and has the largest peninsula in the Western Hemisphere. I would describe the landscape here as very diverse, with vast areas of sumptuous forest, grand majestic mountain ranges, sensational-looking glaciers, vast areas of natural wilderness, miles upon miles of coastline, bays, foyds, tundras and taiga, and of course the visceral Arctic plains. Then there is so much natural indigenous wildlife here, from brown and black bears to polar bears, caribou, moose, bison and mountain goats, Dell sheep, wolves, wolverines, and so much more. We have it all here, and it's usually a lot bigger than anywhere else. I live in a very sizable, functional, minimalistic and practical wooden cabin, which is unembellished and exceedingly modest, although it is furnished with very cosy furnishings designed more specifically for comfort rather than style, which is how Alaskans tend to prefer to live. I live here with my extended family, which has been something I've always appreciated, especially the older members of my family, most particular my grandfather. He's such a wise, sapient old soul, with a very good heart and a feisty, mischievous sense of humour. My grandfather was once a tracker and esteemed hunter, and has so much life experience behind him. He always tells me exactly what he thinks. I remember once I started to date a young girl called Amanda, who was from Juneau, and my grandfather took me to one side and said, "Son, you really don't want to be dating her." I said, "But Pops, she's so pretty, and I really like her." "Pretty she may be," he said, "but that does not last, sonny boy. Beauty is fleeting, but is that miserable, sullen face of hers ever going to make you smile when you return home from a hard day of work on a cold winter's day, 50 degrees below zero? Is that cold face you want to see greeting you when you enter the house, longing for a little warmth, and you are met by the Ice Queen herself? You may end up even more freezing than before you entered your home, if you get my drift." "What do you mean, Pops?" I asked. "She hasn't got a humorous bone in her body, son. I noticed the 3 times you brought her over for dinner with the family. Did her face break into a smile once? No, not even once did the edges of her mouth move, not once. You need a woman with a sense of humour, with a smile that will melt ice, not a frown that will freeze everything over, including your heart. You need someone who doesn't take life too seriously and can laugh at themselves. How can you ever have fun with an ice queen? It's not possible, son. Believe me, I know that from bitter experience myself. I have to tell you, I listened to my grandpa, and I didn't see Amanda ever again because I knew he was right. He helped me to see beyond her pretty face, something as a young man I failed to do, as I was taken in by Amanda's attractive appearance, but my pops was right. She lacked a very good sense of humour, and that's something a good man needs in his life, especially in Alaska on those long, dark, cold winter's days when companionship, friendship, and laughter are so significant. One time I actually brought a friend home with me, and my grandfather told me not to trust him for a single second. "Why?" I said. "He's a nice dude, Pops." "No, there's something distinctly off about him. I don't like his furtive eyes that dodge eye contact. I don't like the way he keeps rubbing his nose whenever you ask him a question. That's a clear sign of dishonesty, as any body language expert will tell you." Of course, my grandfather was exactly right. I found out later my friend was actually arrested for beating up his mother in a drunken stupor. My granddad sensed and discerned his character long before I even got an inkling that something was amiss with him. I think older people seem to have this invaluable quintessential life experience behind them. It enables them to discern things through more discriminating and judicious eyes. They have a sagacious, prudent ability to judge character shrewdly. They can teach a younger, naive generation a great deal of insightful common sense. I think it's hardly a wonder that Indigenous people have always revered their cultural elders and sought after their sapient, percipient advice and guidance for many generations. My strange, peculiar story begins when I decided to take a solo flight in my bush plane over the Alaskan wilderness. I enjoy living up to my prodigious reputation as the White Hawk of the skies, which was elected by my grandfather, who describes me as a warrior of the skies. Jokes aside, I really enjoy flying, not just for necessity, but also for pleasure, and it is something I do almost as naturally and as instinctively as brushing my teeth. Some people go out for dinner or to a spa to relieve stress, but for me nothing beats soaring up in the skies over the white glaciers, tundra and mountain ranges of the vast Alaskan wilderness, most especially in winter, when getting out of the house is crucial, especially when there's not much daylight to enjoy, so you need to make the most of it in order to get that critical vitamin D booster. I do think some people here suffer from seasonal affective disorder really badly during the winter months, and I don't even think they know it. This is why I emphatically believe we have a problem with alcohol and drug abuse here in a big way. I don't think that they actually understand that depression is related to low levels of ultraviolet light, which is crucial for our overall sense of well-being. My friend Martin used to suffer a helpless feeling of despair every time winter came along here in Alaska, and it really dragged him down in a big way emotionally. My pops told him it was possibly due to not enough ultraviolet light exposure and low levels of vitamin D in his body. So Martin began ultralight therapy with a UV lamp that he purchased online, and he also took vitamin D supplementation. I promise you that in a trice his depression and heaviness completely left him, and he never ever looked back. Since then he's never been depressed. So if you do know anyone affected by the winter blues, tell them to try the UV lamp therapy and vitamin D supplementation. I promise you it really works. Now, whenever I fly anywhere, I always take vacuum-sealed matches, a fire starter, knife, food such as jerky and dried fruit because it doesn't take up any space, extra water bottles, and a signal mirror, as well as a flashlight, because once again, my pop insists I do this. He's also always ascertained that it's better to be safe rather than sorry, and to leave home prepared for the worst, hoping for the best, but planning for the worst in every eventuality. So one day in the winter of 2015, I decided to take a quick flight over the Alaskan wilderness. I really felt a little flat, and I knew a flight would lift my spirits once I was airborne, levitating above the earth on my wings. I informed Pops I'd be back later in the day, and off I went, taking to the air like a majestic eagle in flight, with outstretched wings, while I feasted and celebrated the sublime views below of tundra, glaciers and mountain ranges, lakes and forests, with the same gluttonous greed and appreciation of a hungry eagle, with piercing eyes focusing on a sizable, delectable rabbit that he'd liked for dinner. I know of no way to describe to you the wondrous feelings of being elevated and suspended in the sky above the earth. I assure you, once you've owned a pair of wings, it's like owning a car or a cell phone. You can't imagine how you ever managed without it. As I was appreciating and savouring the ravishing scenery over this magical, enchanting winter wonderland, I began to circle my plane and turn it around to retreat back from whence I'd come. I was feeling invigorated and uplifted from my flight. Suddenly my plane went into a wing stall, which really meant that only one of my wings was still operational, while the other one wasn't. My plane began to wobble, rattle, shake, shudder, tremble, and quake violently, and despite my very best efforts handling the controls, I began to go down in a spiraling, oscillating, and convulsing way as the ground quickly began to get closer and closer to me. I was absolutely certain I was about to die, and there was nothing I could do to stop it, because everything was happening too fast to even react emotionally or physically. Then quite suddenly my plane went down with a thunderous almighty crash, and I was ejected out of the plane like a bullet from a rifle, landing first on this large rotten hollow tree that broke apart slowly as I fell. This large hollow tree cushioned and softened, breaking my fall considerably, probably saving my life in the process. I realised in utter shock that I was still alive, landing on the snow with an almighty jolting thud. I was terrified to look down at my body. I was so dazed, groggy, disorientated and benumbed. I opened my eyes ever so slowly, feeling far too apprehensive about what I would see and how many injuries I had sustained. I looked down and could see that my now flaccid, floppy legs were seriously broken, much like a rag doll's, lacking torsion and no longer functional. They felt like a great big blob of pendulous jelly beneath me, and the pain was so excruciating and unlike anything that I've ever experienced in my life before. It would seem that my drooping feet were in a terrible state, as they were already swelling up like balloons in my boots. I could not remove them because it just hurt too much. My languid incapacity potentially meant that I would possibly freeze to death out here before anybody ever came to my rescue. If the cruel, biting, impartial, dispassionate cold winter weather didn't kill me first, of course. I also ran the horrifying risk of being devoured by wild animals, especially as darkness prevailed over this vast stretch of glistening white Arctic wilderness. Things did not look favourable for me. I discerned that I was too disabled to successfully drag my body towards the plane to retrieve some of my essential belongings. Once the adrenaline levels had subsided, the pain began shooting through my body like a space rocket on full throttle, and my body felt like it wanted to explode, as the pain was insufferable and tortuous. It would seem the slightest movement caused me to suffer the most punishing, intense, debilitating, and mind-blowing pain that I can't even begin to describe to you. I couldn't call for help either, because my cell phone was in the plane. It would grow dark soon, and any search party would be unable to find me. It was a hopeless, precarious situation for me, where time was really running out, and luck was clearly not on my side. I was inevitably going to face freezing conditions that can literally kill you, and wild animals that would see me as an easy meal, like bears or wolves. My only defence would be trying to startle any approaching wildlife to scare them off by making a massive commotion. But of what use was that when I could barely keep my eyes open? It was a losing battle for me, as the tiredness seized my body with the gripping forcefulness of a lion's jaws on my jugular. I was unable to fight back, try as I might. I became overwhelmed by sleep, with the potency of a powerful drug or anaesthetic over which you have no control to resist, despite your very best efforts to prevail. I awoke to find myself still alive, and that was my very first surprise, because I didn't expect that at all. The second bombshell was that I found myself lying in this rudimentary igloo-like shelter that was made from layers of timber and thick blocks of snow for insulation. If that wasn't odd enough, my body was covered in the most smelly pelt of a grizzly bear for warmth, and my boots had miraculously been removed from my feet and were lying by my side. I could see that my crashed plane was also lying outside the igloo, so someone had built me this shelter very recently, close to the plane crash, and carried my body here. I had no recollection or memory of this mysterious event, nor did I have any memory of who had rescued me. I knew I must have passed out from the galvanizing pain because it was so unbearable, And it was now getting significantly worse, now that I'd opened my eyes, as my legs were throbbing so violently. I thought a hillbilly living off-grid must be somewhere living out here in the wild, and had discovered me by chance and built this shelter for me. I felt really safe knowing that I was being taken care of, and hoped that he'd called for help on my behalf. I closed my eyes and went back to sleep, as it was the only relief and respite I got from the agonizing pain. I was so grateful to be warm and safe, away from the dangers and perils of predators, and out of the freezing cold wintry conditions outside that were worsening by the minute, as I could hear the blistering Arctic wind punneling against my shelter. I woke late in the morning when the light had cast its radiance over the vast Alaskan wilderness, so I could see visibly, very well and clearly. Luckily the howling winds had finally subsided. I could hear the stranger who'd rescued me whistling outside my igloo, and I could see his hazy, shadowy silhouette wandering around outside. He appeared to be wearing a thick coat like that of a bear. Before long I heard him approaching my igloo, and he stood in the doorway looking directly at me to see how I was doing. I looked up at him, but nothing could prepare me for what I was seeing. This was no man, this was Bigfoot. I knew this at once based on his appearance. This critter was easily 10 foot tall. I'd say he was between 800 to 900 pounds, but I can't be sure about that. He was also about 3 foot wide. He was lanky and lean and slender, but at the same time hefty and big. I noted that his powerful muscles were very immense, and he would make some of your best bodybuilders look puny and pathetic. Nothing prepares you for the size of such a predator. I assure you, even a bear would seem small by contrast to Bigfoot. I think what astonished me the most was the critter's agility and grace, because indeed something so heavily built should not be able to move with such effortless fluidity. The critter was covered in a long, very thick winter coat, the colour of a dark black bear, but there were patches on his coat that were tortoiseshell in colour, with very long arms and legs. He possessed a head the shape of a dome or arch that was low slung upon his head and flowed down to his shoulders, and he seemed to be able to swivel his head around rather like an owl does. Well, that's what I perceived anyway. I noticed that the grey face was completely hairless, although the texture was very thick and leathery, and the critter had a prominent, defined, exceedingly wrinkled and deeply furrowed brow ridge, and a very flat, wide, large nose, with flared nostrils, and a slender but large mouth, and deep-set eyes the colour of caramelised hazelnuts. Upon seeing the Bigfoot I was stunned. I just stood there staring at him with eyes as wide as saucers and a mouth that hung to the ground in astonishment. I simply couldn't comprehend what I was discerning, as it seemed completely surreal. Could this actually be real? I could not make any sense of it at all. I was stunned. In truth, if I'd encountered this critter in the wild, I would have fled a long time ago in terror, because based on physical appearance, his sheer size and appearance was exceedingly alarming. Yet I wasn't afraid, because the critter seemed to care about me, and I could see the kindly expression was written in his eyes. I sat up and pointed towards my plane. The critter seemed to understand, because he proceeded to go towards the plane, and he pulled out a seat and brought it over to me. I then shook my head and continued to point, and he began to bring up other pieces of the plane that he just pulled out, like another chair and a wing, which was all rather amusing. I kept shaking my head and then continued to point. Eventually he did bring me the loose items in the plane, like the emergency rations and my cell phone. I couldn't believe it. My hands began to shake in excitement when I phoned my pops and gave him my coordinates, and he phoned the emergency lines on my behalf. I could hear the trembling in his voice and his joyful relief to hear my voice. He obviously thought I was dead. He informed me that they'd been searching for me all morning because a night search had been futile, and they had all feared the worst. While I was on my cell phone, the Bigfoot watched me very curiously, swaying his head from the left to the right and from the right to the left, and he also copied my movements on the cell phone, and then began to chat away like I was. "Who is that with you?" asked my grandfather. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I said. "Where is he from?" asked my grandfather. "I'm not sure I'm familiar with that language." "Well, he's from around here," I said. "May I speak to him?" said my grandfather. "I really appreciate him rescuing you like this. I assume that's what he did. I'll never be able to thank him enough. Please hand the phone over to him." I held the phone so that my grandfather could hear the strange noises that the Bigfoot was making, and then the phone cut out. I then pointed to the cell phone and indicated for the Bigfoot to come close, and that's when I began to show him the pictures of all my family. I pointed out pictures of my pop and my mother and my family members, and he seemed so interested and began to chatter away to me very excitedly, as if I was an old friend of his. He studied each picture with very big, huge eyes. He was so fascinated. I handed the Bigfoot my jerky and dried fruit. He opened them up and poured the raisins directly into his mouth, gobbling them up in one mouthful. It was so funny to watch. He seemed very satisfied. He certainly enjoyed them. Before long I could hear the sound of a plane, and at that time the Bigfoot began to growl very wearily. I don't think he liked the sound of the craft, and he looked very concerned by the noise, and fearfulness came into his eyes, and he quickly retreated away, gliding away flawlessly. Before long I was taken to hospital, where I had to undergo multiple surgeries, as I'd indeed broken my leg in several places and shattered my pelvis. Everybody was amazed that in my state I'd actually managed to survive a night in the freezing cold wilderness without being killed by wild animals. People assumed that some strange mountain man who lived off-grid in the Alaskan wilderness had somehow rescued me, but I never told them that Bigfoot had actually saved my life, apart from my grandfather, Pops, who believed my story 100%, but advised me not to tell anybody else about it. He also remembered the strange sounds he heard at the end of the line, and knew that they weren't human. My grandfather did some research about Bigfoot for me while I was in hospital, and he told me it was so important to buy the Bigfoot gifts, so he went all the way to Walmart while I was in hospital and brought a massive box of dried fruits and fresh fruits and nuts and crisps and all kinds of things, and got a friend of mine to fly them to the area where I was rescued. The pilot thought my grandfather was leaving them for the hillbilly, or the mountain man that he believed had rescued me. He had absolutely no idea it was Bigfoot, and my grandmother never said a word, but he thought I should share my story with you in this anonymous forum. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Priya, and I'm from Delhi in India. And believe it or not, I had an idiosyncratic, outlandish Bigfoot encounter in Alberta, Canada in 2008, when I was staying at a really bewitching country cabin surrounded by wood green and a picturesque pond overlooking the most incredibly statuesque mountains. Of course, coming from India, I'd never heard of such an anomalous creature like Bigfoot before. I'm not sure, actually, that anyone here has actually heard of the creature known as Sasquatch. It was certainly the last thing that I ever envisaged encountering in Canada, but it would seem that my encounter was already preordained by the hairy man himself, as incredibly nonsensical and preposterous as that may sound. But you will soon understand why, as my story gradually unfolds, rather like a closed rosebud that slowly blossoms out into a full open bloom, revealing the full extent of its glory. For a long time I could not perceive what I had beheld until I did my own research on the Bigfoot known as Sasquatch when I returned from Delhi. This was when I realised that the critter that I'd encountered was a Bigfoot, a hairy man, or a Sasquatch, or even Yeti, and I know that my life was forever transformed by that creature. Before I begin my story, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Delhi, the capital of India, which is the largest democracy in the entire world, and is a very dynamic, social, vibrant and bustling city. Living in Delhi is very definitely a daily assault on your senses, as you are surrounded by hundreds of people, traffic jams, cows and very lively energy. Wherever you have people, you invariably almost always have drama, and that's what makes Delhi a very exciting, enthralling place. Some foreigners perceive Delhi as a filthy, sprawling metropolis filled with inequality, crime and tummy bugs. Although that is certainly true, there is so much more to this marvellous place than meets the eye, and the street food with the stalls selling delicious snacks and eateries are not to be sneezed at, because they are a cultural experience that is rich, expedient and exceedingly edifying. Summers here can be very, very hot, but believe it or not, we do get chilly winters, something that most foreigners don't always appreciate about India. I live in a residential area in an attractive apartment block with my husband Raja in an affluent neighbourhood called Green Park. I work as a marriage investigator, which has become a thriving business since modern technology has changed the way Indian people search for marital love. This is often done online. Even today, India is a very conservative country, and 95% of Indian marriages are still all arranged. Divorce affects only about 1% of our population and is highly frowned upon. In previous generations, marriages were usually always arranged by the bride's parents. However, these days, with the advent of modern apps available online, it makes the platforms accessible to so many. Parents don't necessarily always choose their daughter's or son's partner, which has made many parents feel very disenfranchised. Young people can choose some obscure and faceless stranger online that they may wish to marry, and this is where my job comes into play. It would seem that with so many ambivalent, questionable arranged marriages being planned online, invariably the parents become beleaguered and unhinged about a potential marriage suitor, as invariably they don't know anything about him or her, that can cause them to become very frazzled and jaded because they need some reassurance from their perspective that as they have no control or ascendancy over an arrangement done online, which can be precarious at the very best of times. In previous generations, they knew all the details about the family their daughter or son would be marrying into, but now it has become a little like a lucky dip. It would be like buying anything online that you might perceive on the surface to be rather satisfactory, but when you finally receive it in the post, you end up invariably very disappointed as it fails to meet your high expectations. This is why the parents contact me to do a thorough investigation on the partner that their daughter is going to marry, or vice versa. Sometimes we even get the fiancé wanting his or her potential suitor to be thoroughly investigated, or even an uncle or a brother desirous to know if the marriage partner for their loved one is indeed of noble repute or character. This means I have to get out there in the thick of it all and do some field surveillance to ascertain all the important facts that my clients need to know about the fiancé-to-be. Is he from the right caste? Is he a man of noble, moral, incorrupt character? Does he drink and smoke? Is he a womanizer? Whereabouts does he work? What are his parents like? Does the mother have a temper and throw pots and pans all over the place? You'll be absolutely amazed the things I find out and discover. Sometimes clients desire honey traps to be used as bait to lure a partner in with the help of a seductress to see whether he takes to it. Whilst I have stopped thousands of marriages in their tracks by my less than favourable revelations, I've also enabled people to get married with the security and confidence of knowing that the person they've chosen to marry is a man and woman of sound and virtuous character. When Indian girls get married, they move in with the mother-in-law's family, so it's very significant to do surveillance on the members of that household, as invariably that family structure will become the bride's future lifelong home. On my investigations, I've often worn disguises and surreptitiously found out everything I needed to know from neighbours and people affiliated with the person in some way. I try to do this with discretion and without arousing suspicion. The marriage detective business is booming in India, but you can end up in some rather sticky, precarious situations, which was why I got out of Delhi for a while and took a random trip to Canada on the spur of the moment to escape a man who was after my blood and quite literally wanted me dead. It all began when one day the distinguished father of a daughter from a middle-class family came to visit me at my offices here in Delhi. I gather his young daughter had met someone on an online site and decided that this was the man that she wanted to marry. It would seem the father was very concerned, as the man seemed unnaturally obsessive about his daughter, despite the fact that they'd never ever met. The father needed me to find out the character of this man, and as much as I could about the soon-to-be mother-in-law. He wanted to know what she spent her money on and what kind of a person she actually was, and so forth. All this information was of paramount importance to my client for his peace of mind. On the day of my investigation, I was wearing a very distinctive, rather stylish, bright pink cotton dress with a white zigzag pattern on it that I had bought the previous day at a street market on a sale. This was a spur-of-the-moment thing, as every Indian woman has a sharp eye for a good bargain. The pink dress is very significant to my story. I did not feel the need to disguise myself on this occasion. The young man lived close to Green Park, where I live, so I decided to walk around the area and casually ask some questions to anyone who might actually know him. I began asking one of the effusive, garrulous neighbours about the gentleman in question, and he proceeded to inform me that the man was violent, hot-tempered, and a very heavy drinker who occasionally indulged in narcotics. Worse still, he had a feisty, cantankerous, crazy, and very disagreeable mother that the locals disliked intensely, so much so that they called her the Snake. As I was speaking to this neighbour, I suddenly got this ominous feeling that I was being watched. To my absolute horror, I was right. I discerned a grim-looking, portly, middle-aged woman who was hiding behind a bush and taking pictures of me from behind my back. The loquacious neighbour informed me that this was indeed the gentleman's mother, or the Snake, if you like. I could tell by her hostile, abrasive manner that she was not a good woman. I believe the man's mother was returning to the apartment block when she suddenly overheard my conversation with the neighbour, so she subsequently hid behind a bush to eavesdrop. I believe she was calling her son on her cell phone to inform him of what had just transpired. I imagine she must have told him that I was a private investigator hired by his fiancée's parents, and that I was going to give them negative feedback about him, which would ultimately mean his marriage would be called off, which was the last thing he wanted. The woman began shouting abuse at me. "I'll get you," she screamed. "Just you watch. Wait until I tell my son what you've done spying on us, and asking all kinds of questions about my family. You're living on borrowed time." I quickly scurried away. This was the first time that I'd been caught red-handed doing an investigation, which left me feeling very unsettled and discomposed. Suddenly I saw the young man whizzing on his motorbike towards me. He had received his mother's cell phone message and had been geographically close by and was speeding now in my direction. He was shouting obscenities and shaking his fists furiously. "I'll get you," he shrieked. Could it get any worse than this? My heart was thumping violently in my chest, and I could feel a cold sweat breaking out. I knew I was in grave trouble, as I could see he was up to no good by the furious, enraged expression upon his face. If looks could kill, he was wearing that look. He had spotted me because his mother had sent a photograph of me wearing the distinctive, conspicuous pink dress. I sensed he was after my blood, and I was terrified. I immediately sprinted away as fast as I could, while his motorbike shadowed me. I ran towards a large crowd of people in a street market, and for a moment the man on the motorbike lost me as I quickly disappeared into a large crowd. This is one thing that's rarely good about Delhi. You can literally slip into a large crowd and seemingly vanish into thin air. I ran into a dressing room of one of the stores that was selling racks of discount clothing, and changed into another outfit, which I brought from the shopkeeper. Then I surreptitiously discarded my pink dress that I'd been wearing in a nearby dumpster. I suddenly heard loud screams on the street towards the main road, and that was when I ran out to see what the raucous commotion was all about. I knew instinctively that something quite terrible had happened, and I wasn't wrong. That was when I saw her. She was lying in the middle of the road, the poor young woman who looked much like myself, wearing the same identical pink dress that I'd bought a day ago in the market on a flash sale. I was informed by a couple of onlookers that a young man had deliberately pushed this woman in front of a fast-moving car and fled the scene. It would seem the police were just regarding it as an accident, despite being told by the onlookers that the young woman had been violently and intentionally pushed into the middle of the road. The poor driver looked absolutely mortified and kept saying, "I didn't see her. I didn't see her." I felt so much compassion for him, but I also knew instinctively that the woman in the pink dress had been mistaken for me, and she had lost her life due to my bungled investigation and on my account. She had been falsely identified by the man on the motorbike because of the same dress that she was wearing, and she was a similar size to myself. I blamed myself for not being assertive enough. I learnt the poor woman was visiting from Mumbai, and it would only be a matter of time before the young man discovered he'd killed the wrong woman when I reported back to the parents about his character to stop the marriage. I knew he'd be after me once again. All he had to do was to get the details of my agency out of his fiancée, and I was dead. Unfortunately, here in India, people can sometimes get away with grueling and grisly crimes like murder. I know a lawyer who's always walking around with a couple of bodyguards here. He defends families who've beaten their loved ones to death simply because they dishonoured their family name in some way by running off with someone they fell in love with from a lower caste. In India, when a family is shamed by one of their offspring, some families consider it a crime punishable by death, and they will willfully take deadly action against that family member themselves. The lawyer I speak of has won all of his cases apart from one. When my husband learnt what had transpired in the market, he told me to leave the country immediately until things finally settled down in Delhi. I packed up my suitcase, bid my husband farewell, and booked myself an on-air Canada 14-hour, 45-minute flight from Delhi, India, to Toronto, Canada, and then I was taking a 4-hour trip from Toronto to Alberta. My husband and I had been planning this trip for a very long time, but not by manner of escape like this for me. But thankfully everything was up to date, including my visa and passport, so I was ready for my American or Canadian adventure. And even though it was all last minute, I was exceedingly excited about this solo off-the-cuff escapade. While I was on the last part of my journey, in the second aeroplane flying from Toronto to Alberta, I sat next to a very charming gentleman who told me if I wanted to stay in a whimsical cabin in Alberta, his parents had one that they rented out on their land. He gave me the details of the place. "You'll love it," he told me. "It's beautiful in a remote part of Alberta, surrounded by exquisite scenery, and my mother will order anything that you need. The place is exquisitely beautiful, and it's kitted out as she rents it out very regularly. And the very good news is it's available now because they had a last-minute, all-of-a-sudden cancellation, which never ever happens normally. The place is usually booked up 2 years in advance." I told him to contact his mother at once and to inform her that I'd love to take the cabin. When you've lived in India all your life, surrounded by tons and tons of people, it is hard to express to you how mesmerising the Canadian landscape is. I remember staring out of the taxi window, just being in awe, in rapturous awe, at the undulating whimsical prairies, grazing pastures, quaint barns, farmhouses, statuesque mountains, glaciers, lakes and ponds that we passed on our journey. The first thing that got my attention is the sheer size of everything, and the feeling of never-ending space is just so mind-blowing and boggles the senses. Finally, the taxi took a turning down a long rural road, proceeding to take a few more turns here and there, until finally he took a left-hand twist in the road, ambling down the steep rocky pathway that was precariously bumpy, with a sign that read Swallow's Nest Cottage. We drove through the open gate down a long turf-lined driveway towards a quaint, charming cabin that was nestled in an enchanting little clearing that overlooked a beautiful silvery pond that was flanked by a line of vertical alpine trees. In about a 3 o'clock position, 200 yards away from the rustic cabin, was a tall, towering row of alpine trees that stretched back quite a way back on a high mountainous elevation of sumptuous thick forest. I got out of the taxi, paid the driver, and watched him driving away down the long, windy driveway. I stood there motionless, like a statue frozen in time, as I absolutely marvelled at the ravishing, panoramic views that I was beholding. How I wished with all my heart that my husband Raja was here with me to feast his eyes on this idyllic treasures of such an awe-inspiring, mesmerising, beautiful scene. The little wooden cabin made from pine was just so incredibly beguiling and so very quaint. It was like something that you would expect to see on the cover of a box of Swiss chocolates. Suddenly I saw a woman in a large jeep driving down the driveway towards me. She got out of her car wearing a pair of jeans and a loose cotton top that was rolled up at the sleeves. I could see that she was in her early 50s, with a smooth, unlined complexion and very fair skin with blue eyes. "Hello," she said, smiling warmly at me and giving me a spontaneous hug. "I'm Gina," she said. "My son informed me that you'd like to take the cabin, and your luck is in, as I did have a last-minute cancellation. Do you know that never ever normally happens? I think you were meant to have the cabin for some reason." "I think so too," I said to Gina. "What are the chances that I'd be sitting on this flight to Alberta right next to your son, and that you'd have this cabin available for me?" "I know," laughed Gina. "I'm a firm believer in destiny. Some things are just written in the stars. So you were meant to be here in Alberta at this very point in time. That seems very clear to me. I think you're right, I reflected. I even flew out here on a whim. Well, I've got everything that you ordered in the cabin, and if you need anything else, just give me a call. And if you do get lonely, I'm in the big ranch-style house over there. You're more than welcome to join us for dinner or drink, she said, smiling. If you need to go to town for anything, there are numbers of taxis that you can use, and I've pinned the notes with all the relevant information on the refrigerator with a magnet for you. Everything you need is in the cabin, like bear sprays, fishing rods, and the likes. Enjoy your stay, and welcome to Alberta, she said, handing me the keys. I watched Gina driving away and thought what a lovely lady she was. I enthusiastically opened the cabin door, and it was indeed the cutest cosy den that I've ever seen in my life. It was sumptuously decorated with only comfort and style in mind. There was a sizable king-size bed in the far corner of the room, arrayed with Egyptian cotton sheets and exquisite bed linens. It was scattered with colourful cushions. There was also a huge white settee situated next to the large stone fireplace, and there was a coffee table right next to it that was covered in interesting coffee table books on Alberta. The pine cabin walls were covered in interesting contemporary artworks, and the little tiny kitchen was perfectly equipped with swanky, modern and very efficient designs. I loved the way that you could lie back on the comfy bed with the sliding glass doors wide open that led out onto the wraparound deck or balcony. I realised you could literally sit on your bed with the binoculars and watch all the animals approaching the pond for a drink in the evening. I mean, does it get better than that? I felt that I'd died and gone to heaven. After I ate a light snack, I eventually lay down on my bed, with my head raised up against a mountain of pillows, with the pair of binoculars in my hand, and I began to scour the area around the large pond. It was a sizable body of water that was flanked on every side by alpine trees. In the distance, the triangular, rugged sculptural shapes against the skyline, I could discern the shadowy haze of the statuesque mountains. The fading blue sky was now dappled and grey as the sun finally began to set, and it was painted in resplendent yellow tangerines and golds, almost as if an artist with a large paintbrush was splashing the escarpment in flamboyant, pretty colours. I knew before long that darkness would ultimately descend over the valley. With my binoculars I scanned the water, and just as I had anticipated, I discerned some deer trotting towards the water's edge and lapping up the water, while their white tails twitched. I could see a mother doe with her suckling fawn that I noticed was struggling to stand on its feet, as it was wobbling precariously. I knew it must be recently born. Suddenly I noticed the mother deer growing very alarmed as she sniffed the air, almost as if she could sense a predator, and the deer that had congregated at the water's edge suddenly scattered very fast, rather like greased lightning. This was when I saw something very strange. At first I thought it was a man wearing a gorilla costume, which I thought was very odd. It was only when I studied the man through the binoculars clearly that I realised what I was discerning was not a man, for indeed no man could be this large, for I have never seen a man that was easily over 10 foot tall, 3 feet wide, and 900 pounds. I could also discern that as the critter moved, so did his sinewy muscles beneath his hair, so I absolutely knew that this was no costume, and that left me feeling very perturbed, rattled and exceedingly unsettled. As you can imagine, I was gobsmacked. I've never contemplated that anything like this could actually exist in our reality, so I was really thrown off guard. My hands began to tremble as I continued to observe the critter. I noticed he was covered in long flowing dark brown hair with an attractive golden red hue. The areas under his arms and around his knees were almost bald. As he stood, his powerful long muscular legs were bent at the knees, and his arms were unusually long. I was also certain that he could possibly walk on 4 legs as easily as on 2. I was astonished by the sheer dense weight of this creature. How could anything this hefty stand on 2 feet with such agility and grace? A human of a similar weight would barely be able to walk even a couple of steps, and yet this creature stood tall with ease. I noticed the head was shaped rather like a pyramid and seemed to flow into his shoulders, and there was no evidence of a neck. I gasped as my binoculars focused on the creature's face, because I could see a distinct humanness in his gait, but also in that face of his. I observed that the face was long but broad, with a very pronounced brow ridge that was acutely wrinkled. The skin was the texture and colour of a rhino. The nose was very flat and exceedingly wide, and the deep-set dark eyes were treacle in colour. The creature was standing on the edge of the pond, scratching his head. I discerned that he was definitely immersed in thought. Then he began to wade in the water's edge, until finally he let his body down into the water and began to swim. I wondered where he'd gone because he vanished, and then his head reappeared again, and I realised he'd gone under the water and held his breath for a considerably long period of time. All of a sudden the grey sky grew darker and the night began to roll in fast. I did observe the critter getting out of the water. He shook off his coat rather like a dog, and then just vanished from my sight. I could not believe what I'd seen, and before long I began to feel my body growing very sleepy. I left the large sliding doors of my bedroom and deck area wide open, because I enjoyed the cool breeze of the fresh mountain air blowing gently against my face on this soulful warm night, and I loved listening to the sounds of the crickets and the frogs. I was exhausted from my overseas flight, as I'd travelled economy class, and you never ever get a decent night's sleep on those cramped seats. So, as you can imagine, I fell asleep very, very fast. I was awoken in the middle of the night to a very strange, curious shuffling sound. It really sounded like large feet moving across a wooden deck, trying desperately hard to be quiet, but not quite succeeding. I looked up to see 3 huge, towering silhouettes with red eye shine staring down upon me on my bed. I was absolutely terrified. If I had not known any differently, I would have believed I was being visited by ghostly apparitions or creatures from another world. The soft, gentle light of the full moon, combined with one of the inside lamps that I'd left on a nearby coffee table, highlighted the critters' large bodies. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. These creatures ranged in height. The smallest one was about 7 foot, and the tallest 10 foot, and he was the one that I'd seen in the pond earlier in the evening. They were covered in long flowing hair, and although their eyes exuded a menacing red eye shine, I did not discern a negative energy at all. On the contrary, I sensed that they were peaceful, non-threatening, and actually quite congenial. But I sensed they wanted something from me. But what it was, I could not imagine. I was in such a half-dazed, sleepy state that I almost discerned that I must be dreaming. No, this couldn't really be happening to me, surely. I must be having a lucid dream. I sat up more clearly, straightening up my torso so that I could sort of get some perspective, and I stared up at the creatures in bewilderment, realising that they really did want my attention, as they were so focused on me. What were they doing in my bedroom? Why were they so interested in me? And what on earth did they want? I think these critters are telepathic, because the largest creature seemed to hear my thoughts as if they were audible words. I mean, how is that even possible? He reached out and handed me a long necklace of eagle's feathers that was strung on a leather thong of some kind. I took the feathers from the critter, and then they continued to stare at me for a moment, and then they just glided out of the room and were gone from my sight. By this time I was wide awake, and I was shaking so much that I quickly closed the sliding doors behind me and locked them. I ambled to the kitchen and made myself a large mug of tea to compose myself. What the heck, I kept thinking, what the heck did I just see? And why did they give me a necklace of eagle's feathers? It was very, very strange. The next morning I hastily made my way back to Gina's ranch-style home, and I was so happy to see that she was in the front yard, feeding her chickens. She looked up at me in surprise. "How have you settled into the cabin?" she asked. "Is everything to your liking?" "Of course," I said. "May I just take up 1 minute of your time? I need to ask you something very strange and nonsensical, but I would so value your opinion on the matter." "Now you've got me intrigued," she said, smiling. "Let me rustle up a nice cup of coffee for you, and you can tell me all about it." I recounted my tale to Gina, and her eyes grew as wide as saucers. "You mean these creatures were standing around your bed?" she gasped. "I would have been terrified. You poor thing. That must have been one hell of a shock for you." I proceeded to hand her the necklace of eagle's feathers, which she studied curiously. "They gave this to you?" said Gina, looking perplexed. "I wonder why." I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to call my Native American friend Arlo. Arlo actually means spiritual guide, and he's blessed with a second sight. He might be able to tell you what this is all about. Before long, Arlo arrived at Gina's home, and I told him what had happened and the strange visitors I'd received during the night. He was an older man with a Native American appearance and a long mane of dark hair that was tied back in a ponytail. Arlo took the eagle's feathers, closed his eyes, and focused on them. He held them in his hands for a very long time. "You had an encounter with the guardians of the forest that we Canadians call Sasquatch or Bigfoot. These creatures are not just physical. They have powers of telepathy and psychic knowledge. They have an ability to see into the future. The eagle's feathers you have been given need to be worn day and night for 7 days to procure your protection. Your life has been in grievous danger. You need protection, not for yourself, but for a meeting you'll be having in the future in the year 2025. This will be a meeting with a young man who will be tricked into marrying a very evil, duplicitous woman who will bring about his undoing and prevent him from his earthly purpose. We cannot allow that to happen. The guardians don't want that to happen. Under no circumstances must this man marry this woman. He will be coming to you for advice. He will be asking you to check out his spouse. You must tell him that he must not marry her, for her agenda is evil. This is very significant. This man is going to do great things in the future in preserving forests around our planet, most especially here in Canada and in North America. The Sasquatch need you to ensure that this man never marries unless the wife has been chosen by his very own father. For the Sasquatch say that the father is discerning and can see beyond the veil of human physical deception. It was not an accident that you are here. The spirit of the forest and its keepers sent you here, as you have a pivotal role to play in the future, which has long-term ramifications that are very significant for the Sasquatch. I work in the marriage detective business in India, I said. This is all making sense to me. If I wear these feathers, I'll be safe in my own country. Is that what you're saying to me? You'll be safe because the feathers will render you invisible only to your enemy. Once Arlo had left, Gina and I drank coffee together. Most of the morning we just talked and talked about the incredulous encounter that I'd had with Bigfoot. We couldn't believe what had actually happened to me. It was clear that Bigfoot had brought me to Canada just to get me to stop a wedding in 2025, so that that man would play his part in preserving the natural habitat of the keepers of the forest, known as Sasquatch. It seemed as implausible and as far-fetched as a story like Lord of the Rings, but who am I to question a species of creatures that clearly can see into the future? I'm glad that I can play my part. Gina took me all around Alberta and escorted me to so many exciting and wonderful places. We became, and still are today, very firm friends. I did actually wear the eagle's feathers for 7 consecutive days as had been instructed. So when I returned to India, I knew I was safe, and I did actually see the man that was after my blood and intent on killing me. He was there in the street, and he never noticed nor discerned me, so the feathers really worked, because I learnt he had actually acquired my photograph and definitely wanted me dead, but he walked straight past me and never noticed me at all. I'm waiting for 2025 to do my special part in helping the guardians of the forest protect their natural environment. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Sally Ann and I'm from the Lincoln Park neighbourhood in Chicago. My family moved to West Virginia in 2018 when I was about 17 years old, as my mother and father have a joint thriving online business, which meant we were free to live where we wanted in North America, so the world was invariably our oyster. My mother was eager to move to West Virginia because it's such an exquisite part of the world. She fancied being surrounded by wood-green mountains and pretty meadows, and living a life close to the natural world. This was something she was deprived of growing up as a young girl, where she was exposed to life in a busy, bustling metropolis, but it was only on holidays that she could be afforded the panoramic wonders of the natural world that had beguiled and bedazzled her for so very long. As a young girl, she had affirmed to herself that one day she would indeed move to the country, which is exactly what we did as a family, which includes my parents and my two older siblings, Savannah and Emily. We purchased the original farmhouse here that for many decades had stood on several hundred acres of land, but most of the original land had been subdivided and sold off into parts. I gather the original farm was a cotton plantation. My mother fell in love with the old 1800s farmhouse the moment she saw it, and it was in such pristine condition as the previous owners had completely renovated and restored the property and placed extensions on the rear side, increasing the size of the kitchen and the living quarters. The symmetrical whitewashed house was tucked down a gorgeous long driveway, surrounded by undulating verdant grass, with ubiquitous trees scattered liberally across the landscape. There was also vast areas of wood green that was a haven for a colourful kaleidoscope of indigenous wildlife. Then there was a smaller house on the property, a couple of pretty barns, in a bad state of repair, a pond and a beautiful stream that zigzagged through the valley. You possibly think that the story I'm about to tell you is my own personal encounter with the hairy man, but you would be very wrong. The encounters I'm going to share with you happened to a daughter of one of the original landowners of the property who lived on our land when they were growing cotton in the mid-50s. It was only in 2018 that I discovered this woman's book, which she called the Book of Tears, that was all about her life, but also about her strange encounter with a creature that I believe fits the quintessential description of a Bigfoot. My bedroom on the upper floor in our farmhouse possessed its very own stone fireplace, and one day I happened to notice that one of the stones was rather loose, so I pulled it out to find a dark hollow beneath, and instinctively I fumbled around in the hole, feeling around with my hands, and pulled out a black book with a title called the Book of Tears. It was covered in spider webs and dust, and the pages were literally breaking apart, and there was an old photograph in the diary depicting our farmhouse in the 50s, along with a picture of a young woman called Rose. To give you a brief synopsis, it would seem that this Book of Tears belonged to a young girl called Rose, who had lived in our farmhouse during the 50s. I believe that Rose was lonely and very sad, as both of her sisters had died of pneumonia the previous year. She was left as an only daughter on a cotton farm with two grieving parents. I think she used the Book of Tears as a way to unload her emotions onto paper during that grievous year, because a year or so later the family sold their farm. I imagine she forgot to retrieve her diary, which was possibly a good thing because it might have meant that she had finally overcome her dreadful despair. So these are the extracts from her diary about her encounter with what she calls the wild woman that we call Bigfoot. To my Book of Tears, date July the 2nd, 1956. Sadness cloaks my heart every day like a thick black oppressive veil, with a heaviness and subjugation of note. Each day it would seem that my heart withers and dies a little more, like a spring flower fading away from my life, as it is but a shadow of what it once was. The days of joyful laughter and chatter have been all but confiscated so brutally and callously by this cruel twist of fate, as losing my two beloved sisters to pneumonia was not something I could have ever conceived of or fathomed. Our house now wears a gloomy despondency and a desolate mournfulness that no words can express. The countenance of my father has horrified me of late because he has aged 20 years in all but a few weeks. His dark hair is now completely white. I notice the dark shadows powder his face around the rims of his eyes with a sombre repose, and I have beheld a lost vacant expression in his eyes. As for my mother, she has withdrawn from her life like a tortoise shrinking back in its shell. For in these days of grievous sadness there are no words on her lips, as her mouth seems unable to articulate her thoughts, and our house is filled with the foreboding song of silence. I visited the doctor today to discuss my issues with sleep, for during the hours of darkness my mind is restless and wide awake. My doctors prescribe fresh air and exercise, and tomorrow I will engage in this manner of treatment. But I am doubtful such a course of action will make any difference to my very sad plight. To my Book of Tears, date July the 7th, 1956. Something quite extraordinary happened this morning when I went for my leisurely walk in the woods. It seemed so peculiar that even now I am at a loss for words as to what it was that I beheld. I was sure I could hear a baby crying. I wondered where this crying was coming from, and my mind was hijacked by an intense curiosity that I could not suppress. I knew I had to find the source of the crying, so with the stealth of a cheetah and the sharpness of an owl, I crept ever forwards towards the sound, and that was when I saw her. She was seated on the edge of a rocky outcrop, her strong, sinewy back facing towards me, and her body covered in long, flowing, dark brown hair that moved with the breeze. I beheld her long, muscular legs dangling in the water of the gushing stream. It was a wild woman who was built like a giant, strong and powerful, with arms that were very long, in which she held her beloved baby. The baby was so pink it looked like a normal baby, but I realized that the baby wasn't fully human, as its face seemed flatter than ours would be. It only had a scattering of hair on top of its head, and the baby was crying, but the wild woman was bobbing it up and down, and it began to calm down. I cannot determine whether she sensed my presence or not, but all of a sudden she turned around to face me. I beheld her human-like hairless face, leathery deep tan skin, and square jawline that was set in a pyramid-shaped head slung low upon her shoulders. She stood up and became like a towering tree, as her height was impressive to behold. Such was the size of her girth and circumference that I was overwhelmed by a growing sense of intimidation, only accentuating my awareness of how small I felt, for indeed in her presence I became like a timid mouse in the company of a large predatory cat. My heart slowed down in its vital beat, and the colour drained away from my face, and I must have grown white. It would seem that I could not move a muscle, as terrible consternation and dismay overcame my being. I stood there speechless and just stared, for I could not remove my eyes from the wild woman, as despite my trepidation and uneasiness, I was in awe of this strange shaggy beast, for she held my attention with great intrigue, just like the baby that was upon her breast. The wild woman stared at me, and her golden brown coloured eyes studied me with curious intrigue, as if she was aroused by the same idiosyncrasy that was afflicting me, for she was as beguiled and bewitched by me as I was indeed by her. I did perceive that she was not an unkind soul, for her deep-set eyes revealed her genuine heart, and they were friendly and congenial. I watched her bounce the baby on her slender hips, and I could see that she was a very attentive mother. For reasons I cannot comprehend, I pointed to her baby. Maybe it was my way of congratulating her, for the baby was very young, only recently arrived in the world. She misunderstood me, for she glided over to me confidently, putting her baby in my arms to hold. I could hardly believe it. As a mother, her face was filled with joyful pride. She seemed eager for me to appreciate her little sprog as well. I could hardly believe the wild woman allowed me to cradle her own baby, but I knew that she meant well, and she had extended me that hand of friendship and trust, something that I was eager not to refuse. I bobbed the baby up and down in my arms, but it began to howl. I don't think it felt safe in my charge because I was so much smaller than her, and it clearly felt it. So she took it from me and bounced it upon her own hips again, and then the baby calmed down dramatically, and she reassured it, and it began to feel safe in its mother's arms. She beckoned for me to follow her, and I sat with her beside the stream, and we watched the water cascade over the rocks, and for the first time in a long time I knew I was not alone, although no words were spoken between us. The silence seemed to speak its own words, and they were warm and bright, and as sparkling as a summer's day. I felt a happiness surge into my heart, like an ocean wave carrying the first rays of hope for a very long time onto the horizon. July the 12th, 1956. I saw the wild woman today. She was paddling in the stream where the water came up to her calves, the baby seated upon her shoulders, and it's growing fast. When she saw me, she beckoned for me to join her. We sat together on a rocky outcrop, and once again we watched the water cascading across the rocks with a thunderous crashing sound in white bubbles. It was so peaceful, and we watched a dragonfly flying over the water while she continued to nurse her baby, and it suckled hungrily from her full breasts, pushing them with his tiny hands. I noticed the baby is still hairless, but it seemed sharp and attentive today, much more so than a human infant. I gathered some pebbles and threw them into the stream, and she laughed at me because my efforts were so pathetic in her sight. She took some pebbles from me and aimed them at a rock 100 yards away, and she hit the target every time, never missing once. I tried to copy her, but I was unable to throw my rock very far. I was in complete awe at the accuracy of her target. Suddenly I heard my name carried on the wind, and it was my father's voice calling me, so I had to leave her side. I did not want to go, because being with the wild woman makes me happy. I think it's because she's as natural as the green grass and the tall statuesque trees. She is who she is and seems one with the natural world, and I like the earthiness of her nature. July the 20th, 1952. This morning my father had a spontaneous visit from Mr. Peter Cooper. He's the farmer on the furthest side of the valley at the Montgomery homestead. He told my father that his horses were neighing and his dogs barking late last night. He was driven from his bed with a feeling of impending dread. He put on his boots, gathered his rifle and ventured into the prairie, and that was when he saw two wild men covered in hair who were like giant human apes. One of them had a dead deer slung over his shoulders. These wild men are very dangerous, cunning and treacherous, he informed my father. There is no telling what they're capable of doing. They may be after our women or children or even our livestock. So I fired a round of bullets, but the wild men glided away. But one of my bullets hit one of the wild men in the torso, but he kept running forwards. But I could see he was stumbling, but although I followed the trail of blood for quite a time, his body I did not find. But he bled out so much, he surely must have died. But there was no trace of him to be found, for he seemed to have all but vanished. My heart really sank when I heard this dreadful, frightful news, because the wild woman may be related to the shaggy wild men. I imagine she must be. I knew by the way my father was talking with Peter Cooper. They wanted to arrange a shootout to kill all the wild men of the forest by gathering a team of hunters together to hunt them down. I knew I needed to warn the wild woman of their insidiously evil plans. I had to tell her to leave our area at once, because the men here will not rest until their blood is shed. July the 21st, 1952. I'm so glad I found her. I didn't expect her to answer my call immediately, but as I entered the woods I called out her name. The name that I gave her, Strawberry, Strawberry, I called. Then there she was, creeping out of the shadows like a ghost in the night, with her baby on her hips. She glided towards me with her knees bent and the expression on her face earnest and concerned. She beckoned for me to follow her and led me to a huge mound of soil that looked like a burial ground, and then she pointed to her baby and to Peter Cooper's cotton plantation. She play-acted everything that had transpired, and I immediately understood. It would seem that Peter Cooper had shot her partner, and later he died from his wounds, a slow and agonizing death. I felt so sick and nauseous because I sensed her dreadful pain. Even her Sprog is now without a father. She has lost her partner in life. Yet she put me to shame because she was so stoic, philosophical and accepting of this cruel twist of fate that life had now bestowed on her. She wasn't even angry or indignant. How can this be? I should learn from the wizened wild woman who takes death in her stride, knowing that it is an intrinsic natural part of life, of which there is inevitably no escape. For indeed the grave awaits us all at some point in the journey of life, when the road we travel finally reaches a dead end. I proceeded to tell her through action, mimes and words that she must leave our place forthwith, because the hunters wanted to kill her people and would be hunting them down with rifles. She understood the gravity of my words through my feeble attempts to mime that were less than adequate. Yet she received the message clearly, with a gratitude and appreciation of note. In my clumsy actions I pretended to shoot with a rifle, falling down dead, and I pointed to her and to my home and to the Montgomery homestead. She rubbed her head sorrowfully against my arms and touched me gently on my face, looking intently in my eyes, with such a deep love that touched me to the core, for not even my own parents have expressed or exhibited such love as she exuded. I knew she'd grown attached to me, as I had to her, for our friendship was very real. Suddenly the wild woman whistled and let out an alarm call that sounded like an owl hooting 5 consecutive times. I imagine it means we need to leave now. I then heard a sound like the rumble of thunder as the ground began to heave and shake and vibrate, and then there were 5 shaggy wild men of immense height and strength and girth standing before me. They towered above the wild woman, making her appear very small. She spoke to them in a chatter like that of a foreigner, for it was indeed a peculiar dialect. It also had a strange tone that was of a high pitch, but they comprehended what her words meant. I watched them all leave. She pointed towards the east, and I knew where she was heading. My heart was sorrowful and forlorn, my eyes filled with tears. But I now know that the wild woman is safe, and her kind are safe too, and that is all that matters in the end. My heart is grievously sad, for I shall miss her, but she has brought fullness to my life and completion, and has birthed in me a great hope for a new beginning, so that my future does not seem as daunting as it once was. So this was Rose's account of her encounter with the hairy critter that we know to be a Bigfoot, and I'm now living on the very land where she had her extraordinary encounter in the 50s, but I have no idea whether she saw the wild woman ever again, because she never records any other details in the Book of Tears. In fact, that was her last entry. I hope with all my heart that I will encounter one of the wild woman's descendants, because I know that there may be many Bigfoots on our property, and they may be very elusive. More recently, when my father came home one night, he discerned what he believed to be a bear cross his path, and he stopped his car for a short moment. He said his thoughts were conflicted, because the creature was too big to be a black bear, and was bigger than a grizzly. Imagine his amazement when it turned around to look at him directly in the eyes, and held my father's gaze. My father froze with fear, and began to shake violently, but the creature just glided away. My father said when he saw the human-like face, he knew he was observing a Bigfoot, but he was very surprised the creature displayed no aggression whatsoever, for to look at it was like a monster in his sight. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Patrick, but people tend to call me Pat for short, and I'm from the Golden State of Ohio, which is the smallest state west of the Appalachian Mountains. But what it lacks for in size, it more than makes up for with breathtaking, beautiful scenery. Our Elysian state is home to ravishing sights from nature, such as masterful waterfalls, rugged canyons, flowery meadows, thriving wetlands, lakefront beach scenes, and dense verdant woodland. And we are also home to whimsical, charming Amish country. The variable weather here and the changing seasons is so typical of the central United States. We experience rainy springs, warm to humid summers, beautiful crisp and colourful autumns, and cold snowy winters, especially in the Great Lake regions, where it can get incredibly cold. My favourite part of the year is naturally autumn. I love the way the arresting trees change from golds to reds, russets and pinks, because the world becomes so exquisitely arrayed in mesmerising, resplendent colours that I can't stop marvelling at. As I always say to my family in regards to our utopian state, that sometimes the very best things in life tend to come in small packages, and I definitely feel that way about Ohio. It's also pretty cool that we do have a relatively low cost of living here compared to other states. I run our joint relatively small proficient business, or dairy if you like, here with my father, and this extraordinary productive enterprise has been a generational family passion and interest since my great-great-grandfather's day. My beloved and precious extended family lives together on this farm, working as an industrious team, which enables things to run methodically and smoothly. I do hire outside help to help us in managing the dairy, which makes our operation even more auspicious and lucrative, as many hands do indeed make life work. We have a couple of very large cow barns, also storage barns, a machine shed, milk parlour, and the list goes on, but you get the general gist of things. Our farm is very sizable, with acres of grazing pasture, ubiquitous natural wood green consisting of oak, hickory and maple and beech trees. Then there are open prairies, a silvery creek, a couple of ponds, and a gushing stream that literally meanders and zigzags through the large wooded area on our land, which is a haven for the indigenous wildlife here, from white-tailed deer, short-tailed shrews, red squirrels, snowshoe hares, voles, red foxes, coyotes, raccoons, skunks, bobcats, coyotes, and you name it, we probably have it. I live in a large white brick symmetrical 3-storey farmhouse with double-hung windows and emerald green shutters, and also a matching roof, as well as a stunning green front door. Around the rear of our property we possess a wraparound porch that overlooks a very large silvery pond that is flanked by the most exquisite large willow trees. I grew up on this picturesque pastoral farm from when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, with my 2 sisters who now currently both reside in the city of Columbus, both married to their respective partners and are working in town rather than the country, which is a huge change of lifestyle for them. They willingly both admit and concede that they miss the laid-back, mellow, easygoing and serene lifestyle here at our farm. Don't let me mislead you or give you a false impression for a moment. Let me make it exceedingly clear that farm life can be very strenuous, toilsome and tough. It is indeed hard work, but being close to my animals and to nature is my huge passion. It's an idealised, halcyon and peaceful existence, or should I say for me personally, as close to heaven as I can get. I savour and cherish every moment of living here with my extended and magnificent family and my two blessed children, Jennifer and Simon, whom both love having their grandparents around. This setup would never work if we weren't a very close family in the first place, which thankfully we are. I'm blessed that my mother and wife are the very best of friends. In truth, I think if they weren't, it would be very problematic. If I divorced my wife, I'd probably be the one turfed out of the farmhouse first, because my mother would definitely turf me out before my wife, because they're that close. I raise Jersey cows, which is the second largest breed of cattle dairy in the world, that originated from the island of Jersey, hence their name. They're excellent grass grazers and produce the richest, most delicious milk that you've ever tasted, with over 5% butterfat and over 3% protein. Jersey cow milk is richer in calcium than standard milk. Another thing I'd like to add about Jersey cows is that they have gentle, docile personalities and are congenial and exceedingly friendly, with really laid-back, easygoing temperaments. My strange, rather curious story begins with two Jersey cows of mine, one called Magnolia and the other Clover. They began to behave very strangely and exhibit queer, baffling and rather peculiar habits that were incredulous and outlandish. I would go so far as to say they were acting like two bank robbers, furtive and suspicious, as if they were up to something very naughty that they knew very well was wrong. Now, as a farmer, these two cows were exceptionally special to me, because they had rather quirky, capricious, gregarious personalities, and were very loving by nature and remarkably bright and intelligent. I began to notice that either one of these two cows would always be mysteriously missing when it came to rounding up the cows for their milking. It would seem that either Magnolia or Clover had all but vanished into thin air. Ironically, never both of them at the same time. Only one of them would always be at the dairy, while the other one could not be found at all. Stranger still is that whenever Magnolia or Clover were milked, their milk yield was exceedingly low and exceptionally poor. I knew something very peculiar was going on, but I couldn't make any sense of it at all. I was very perturbed and perplexed. When my vet visited the farm to give my animals a general check-up, I told him all about Magnolia and Clover's plight, and about their poor milk yield, which I couldn't understand. He assured me that they were both of sound health, and seemed even more robust than usual, and appeared to be thriving well. "There is no reason why their milk yield is low," he assured me. "It doesn't make any sense to me at all. I've never seen them in such fine health." So one day I decided to follow Magnolia, but I realised when I was around she stuck with several cows grazing in the meadows, and she kept looking at me and surreptitiously kept a close eye on me at all times while she pretended to be focusing on her grazing. If the cows would move to another area, she would follow them, but kept glancing up briefly in my direction to discern if I'd left the field yet. I am certain she was thinking, "When is he going to leave? What is he hanging around for? I wish to goodness he would just go." I knew she wanted me gone. That was when I knew that she definitely was hiding a secret from me, and I wanted to find out what was going on. My curiosity was aroused. I walked away from the pasture and returned, but this time by stealth, sneakily making very sure that Magnolia had not seen me, because she was one clever, discerning cow, and she could notice things very easily. As for Clover, she was nowhere to be found, but I knew that in some way their disappearances and reappearances were connected and interlinked in some way. I carefully manoeuvred my 6-foot slender frame behind a large maple tree and tried very hard to remain as still as I possibly could, hoping with all my heart that I wouldn't be observed. I saw that Magnolia was ascertaining that everything was indeed safe. I watched her large face and curious bright brown eyes, scrutinising the field and sniffing the air. When she finally looked satisfied and was certain that she was safe to finally leave, and that I was not on sight poking around, she decided that she was indeed safe to go and to exit the field. I discerned that she very hastily left the other cows and hurriedly moved away, constantly evaluating her surroundings while she did so. She ambled cautiously through the wood green to a remote quarter, to, I imagine, her assembly point and meeting place with Clover, my other cow. Once Clover saw Magnolia, that was her cue to leave the wood green to join the other cows in the grazing pastures. I was to discover, to my astonishment and absolute amazement, that these two mothers were working in a joint alliance together, and had insightfully and sagaciously divided shifts between themselves, and they had both given birth to their own individual calves that they had hidden from me in the sylvan. They were sharing joint parental responsibilities. Now how profound, savvy and intelligent you have to be to do that. I knew at once that they had grown sick and tired of having their calves always taken away from them, and their maternal instinct was in overdrive, and it was so strong that they were taking turns to nurse and babysit the two calves. This explained why their udders were always dry. I'm not exaggerating when I say I was moved to tears from what I was observing, and from that point on I ensured that Clover and Magnolia could continue raising their calves without them being taken away from them. When you see things like this occurring in nature, you become all too aware that animals have feelings and emotions just like humans do. What right did I have to stop Clover and Magnolia from enjoying the privileges of motherhood, if it meant so very much to them? Maybe I'm a soppy farmer, but I rarely was so moved by this incredible incident, and the lengths that both of my two cows went to hide their calves from me. It really showed an extraordinary level of emotional intelligence. I have worked with dairy cows for many years, and I really do see them as having their own individual personalities, which is why I know them all by name, and usually can tell them apart. I name every one of my cows because they're not just a number to me. I consider myself exceedingly privileged to work with these creatures, and that they've actually crossed my path. I emphatically believe that every living creature has a soul on this earth. I remember when one of my cows called Savannah sadly passed away before the vet could get around to euthanizing her, as her death was very fortuitous and serendipitous. For some unexplained, precocious reason, she became seriously ill, and the vet believed she might have eaten something very poisonous in the meadow. Personally, I have to be with my animals when they're dying to comfort them and reassure them. I do find animals have a very different attitude towards death than we have, as they seemingly have no fear of the afterlife and are very accepting and almost welcoming of it. On this occasion I was stroking Savannah and talking to her, thanking her for her calves and her milk supply that she had given to us over the years, and for being such an asset to my herd. I could tell my presence really comforted her at this critical moment in time. I will never forget when she died. I actually physically saw a light orb leaving her body at the moment of death, and it was utterly incredible. I believe it was her soul. The very next morning there was a red-shouldered hawk on my yard fence, and it watched me go about my business and followed me around the whole morning. That sort of thing doesn't just happen at random. I really felt it was a clear sign from Savannah to say that she was absolutely fine. When you live so close to nature as I do with animals, you see things in the natural world that are so extraordinary they defy natural explanation. So I know emphatically that we never die but move on to another realm of existence. I gather they have proved that our bodies weigh a few ounces less after death, and one scientist firmly believes that this proves the existence of the soul. I'm in no doubt that he's right about that. Going back to my story, one day the same problem arose again for me during the milking in the dairy, as one of my cows, Marigold, was failing to produce any milk, and I immediately suspected that she was hiding a calf somewhere in the wood green from me. It seemed like I had another cow that was being equally as determined to keep her calf hidden from me, and so once again I decided to follow her to see what she was up to, and I hid behind a large maple tree. I could discern that her behaviour was even more peculiar than Magnolia and Clover's had been. She was standing in the sylvan as if she was waiting for someone, and began to moo very, very loudly, as if she was trying to get someone's attention. I then heard a human whistle, answering that moo, and was very, very surprised and perturbed. I was expecting a calf to come running out of the thicket towards her to hungrily feed from her udder, but that was not what I saw. I heard a loud rustling sound that sounded like a pair of heavy bipedal feet were walking towards Marigold. Then I saw him, and nothing was to prepare me for what I was discerning. The only way I can describe him to you was that he looked like a humanoid ape, and was about 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and 3 foot wide. He was covered in a coat that rather reminded me of a red fox, but infinitely more luxurious and magnificent than that, because the kaleidoscope of rich red colours was so bedazzling. The hair was unfortunately very matted and dirty, and the critter was well in need of a bath. He smelt like my sneakers at the time in my life when I'd caught athlete's foot in a very bad way, and it took a few months for me to shift that infection. I was well acquainted with that yeasty, musty, wet dog kind of smell that once had been a problem for me. The creature was so muscular and powerful looking, with very overlong arms and powerful legs, and a cone-shaped head that seemed to flow seamlessly into the shoulders with no evidence of a neck. And the head was very broad in its width, but long in its shape, with a prominent brow ridge, very wide flat nose, and very deep-set golden eyes. The skin appeared leathery and thick, and was a deep tan colour, but it wasn't black or grey. Suddenly I realised to my utter astonishment that I was actually studying a Bigfoot, as the creature did look exactly like the humanoid ape so often described in documented reports and accounts. I'm afraid I'd never believed that such a critter could actually exist here in North America, but now I was seeing one in close quarters, close up and personal, and I knew indeed that it was real. I was absolutely gobsmacked and thunderstruck by what I was discerning. The Bigfoot was carrying 3 of the old pail buckets that my great-grandfather's generation used to use in the olden days for milking by hand. I have dozens of those pails in one of my cow sheds. In 2 of those steel buckets, he was carrying hundreds of apples that he'd broken up into smaller chunks that clearly came from our neighbours' apple orchards. No wonder Marigold was interested in these little rendezvous, as she'd always been predisposed to having a rather sweet tooth, and once when I'd accidentally left the feeding barns open, she had managed to devour a whole food trough of molasses. I could see by the naughty glint in her eye that stealing the molasses was infinitely more fun than being given it directly. I could tell that she looked ever so pleased with herself. Since then I noticed she always had her eye on that barn door, so that she could covertly go pilferaging should I accidentally leave it open again. The large hairy humanoid or Bigfoot I was watching poured out 2 huge buckets of broken up apples onto the ground, and then he turned one upside down and sat on it, although he looked like a man trying to sit on a kid's tricycle because the pail was way too tiny to support his hefty, sizable buttocks, but that seemed of no hindrance to him, as his balance was excellent. He began to squeeze and manipulate Marigold's udders, and proceeded to milk her while she ate the apples. The expression on Marigold's face was one of absolute ecstasy, because she was getting a huge sugar high, and she chewed the apples extra slowly to savour the sweet taste. The hairy critter milked her very efficiently, tweaking her udders like a true professional, filling the pail with her milk, and once the 2 pails were full, he stood up and began to drink from one of the steel buckets. I kid you not when I say this. This Bigfoot lifted a huge bucket of milk in the air, like you or I would drink a mug of coffee and take it to our lips, and he began to drink from it with such extraordinary strength. I mean, who can do that? I noted some of the extra milk started to spill down on his coat, and also rimmed the edges of his mouth, so that he looked like he was wearing a white moustache. He licked his lips appreciatively, and I could tell he thoroughly enjoyed the milk. I was amazed that the critter actually enjoyed drinking milk, but then I suppose they're a lot like us, so why shouldn't they? Marigold was still eating her apple pieces and looking absolutely elated and rapturous, as if she was on cloud 9. It seemed like a great relationship or arrangement, if you like, as for her giving up milk in exchange for apples was a very good deal. Before long the big critter began to stroke Marigold devotedly, like you would a dog, and he chatted away to her affectionately in a strange language that sounded a lot like gibberish. And then finally he gathered the 2 large buckets, now filled with milk, and glided away with a seamless grace, while Marigold reluctantly returned back to the herd. I say reluctantly because Marigold's insatiable sweet tooth means that if she could eat molasses, oats and sweet apples for the rest of her born days, she would be euphoric and delirious with happiness. Even my kids adore feeding marigolds sweet fruits behind my back, most especially apples. They confided in me that they love the sheer look of gleeful rapture in her eyes and the way she chooses to eat the food that we give her so slowly to savour its sweetness. I mean, isn't that extraordinary? As you can imagine, when I sat down at the dinner table that night, I stared out vacantly into space, much like you do when you've had a shock and your mind is 1,000 miles away. That was the effect that meeting a Bigfoot had on me. "Pat," said my mother, "Pat, are you going to have some cornbread or not?" "Oh, thanks," I said, reaching out for a piece. "What's up with you?" said my mother. "You look like you're not compos mentos today. You look 1,000 miles away. What's going on?" "Yes, honey," said my wife, stroking my hand gently. "You've barely touched your food. It's not like you at all. You normally eat like a horse." "Very odd," said my father. "Pat has the healthiest appetite I know. What's going on with you, son?" "I saw a Bigfoot today," I said. "You saw what?" said my mother. "I saw a Bigfoot," I repeated. "Now that you don't believe me, pass me the carrots." "Who said we don't believe you, son?" said my father. "I believe you." "What's a Bigfoot, Mummy?" asked Jennifer. "It's a very big man covered in hair, darling, with big feet and very long arms." "I've seen one of those," said Jenny, "in the wood green. But he ran away. He was covered with hair like a fox." "You saw him?" I asked Jennifer, looking amazed. "I've seen him about 2 or 3 times, Daddy. He hides behind the trees watching us play. He's shy, but he likes to watch us." "I've seen him spying on us too," said Simon. "He is shy, but his hair's a very nice colour." "My father had an experience with a Bigfoot on this farm once," said my grandfather. "It must be from the same family line, because he described it as having a coat like a fox. He said he wished Mother wore her hair in that colour." "Why did you not tell us this before?" I asked my father. "For the very same reason people tend to not talk about Bigfoot, the fear of not being believed." "But I would have believed you, Father. I know you would never lie." "Well, one of my father's calves was having difficulty being born. The cervix hadn't dilated properly, and her uterus was exhausted. The cow was having twins, and it was a difficult birth. My father went to get the forceps to help with the delivery, and when he returned to the barn, he saw a large red-haired Bigfoot helping the cow deliver its 2 calves. Of course, he didn't know it was a Bigfoot at the time. He said that the critter looked like a humanoid ape and was female. When the critter saw him, she fled away very quickly, but she did a great job in assisting the cow in a very safe delivery of 2 of the twins, and my father was not sure he would have delivered those calves quite so safely, or even alive, because it was such a tumultuous, challenging birth that rarely required veterinary help. But there was no time for any of that, so he had to act quickly, and thankfully she intervened. I remember he was bedazzled and stunned by what he'd seen, as he had no idea what on earth she was. He described her as a wild woman covered in luxurious red hair, and he went to the grave never knowing the answers to his many long questions. Of course, he never made any talk about it to the local folk, because on one occasion he recalls one of the locals talking about seeing a dark humanoid ape, and everyone teasing him tirelessly. People called him Monkey Face and asked him if he'd seen any monkeys running around the woods lately. They would scoff all the time. So as you can imagine, my father told my mother and I we were to keep our lips sealed and locked at all times. And we did, of course. I bet you other people must have seen Bigfoot in those days, I reflected, but they all shut up about it. Of course they did. As they do today, reflected my mother. I mean, if I saw one, I wouldn't tell anyone about it. I can assure you of that. After my family discussed in detail my extraordinary encounter with the milk-drinking Bigfoot, we unanimously agreed that Marigold should continue to receive apples from the Bigfoot and in return enjoy her stash of apples. I knew that my milk yield is well in excess of what I sell, so losing a little milk here and there is no train smash for me. I'm a firm believer in working with the flow of the natural world and not against it, because that way your life is intrinsically blessed with bountiful blessings. Well, that's been my experience anyway. So there you are. That's my story. Oh my word, I love that story. Wow, a milk-drinking Bigfoot. Who would have actually thought about it? And I loved your description of the milk being drunk by that creature, lifting that huge bucket to his lips.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.